call their supporters, their followers, to care for the earth or care for creation, and they all call us to care for one another. That's a really great way to bridge the conversation by meeting people where they are and then talking about our common values and what we share together.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Citizens Climate Lobby's July meeting. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Flannery Winchester. I'm a member of CCL's staff. Mark was off this week, so I will be hosting the call today. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Renee Lertzman. For more than 20 years, Dr. Lertzman has been a pioneer in bridging the areas of psychological research and sustainability. She brought those ideas to life in her popular TED Talk called How to Turn Climate Anxiety into Action. Dr. Lertzman is an internationally recognized thought leader and advisor, working with institutions like the World Wildlife Fund, the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences Team, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Columbia University, and many more. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and even at some of our past conferences and events here at CCL. So thank you, Dr. Lertzman, for being here with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you in just a few minutes. Before I hand it over to you, I want to tell you a little bit about the 662 and counting climate advocates that we have on the call with us today. These are people who have been absolutely phenomenal in the face of all the crises that our country is facing right now. In the face of climate change, they've been working for years to try to move Congress forward. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, they've pivoted their activities to be socially distant and continued pushing for climate solutions, all while taking care of themselves and their families and their communities. And now, in the face of America's reckoning with racism, so many of these compassionate, thoughtful people have been asking, what can we do? How can we help? So I just wanted to set the stage for you that you're talking to a group of people who are incredibly dedicated and active, but also dealing with a lot of heavy stuff these days. So I know we're all excited to hear from you. So take it away, Dr. Lertzman.
Thank you. Thank you, Flannery. And thanks to CCL for inviting me to spend some time with you. I am a really big supporter and fan of CCL for so many reasons, particularly because of the way that you model an approach that is really based on inclusivity and empowerment and the kind of, skill building and theory of change that really is based on understanding that we each have tremendous potential and capacity in ourselves to be really effective. So it's very inspiring and an honor to be with you. I'm going to actually set my timer here so I can be mindful of wanting to ensure we have time for questions and discussion, conversation. So I am just going to set the stage a bit for how I'm coming to this topic and these issues. So as you mentioned, I'm coming from a psychological background and orientation. And if you've seen my TED Talk, I speak a bit about the origins of that story, which is that from my very early experiences being exposed to climate change and environmental threats, I experienced it very viscerally as a deeply emotional, mental, behavioral impact. And because I was already planning on going into training as a psychologist at the time when I was 18, 19, what happened was it was almost like this meteor kind of hit my whole consciousness around what it means to be a psychologist in our world today. And from that point on, for me, these domains of climate change and environmental issues are inherently deeply psychological. And I think that, this was like going back a number of decades now. And we continue to learn more about what that means. It's a very evolving field, but I want to just start by setting the context that if we were to accept that climate change is a form of trauma, that it has a traumatic impact on us in many, many, many different ways, whether it's direct, visceral, vulnerable communities, whether it's emotional trauma, whether it's cognitive, kind of the cognitive dissonance where we're feeling like we're suddenly in what I talk about as the double bind, where you're just like, I don't even know how to think about this. I don't know what I can possibly do about this. If we really accept that climate is a type of trauma and that it evokes an array of emotional responses, it changes everything about how we do our climate work. It changes how we communicate. It changes how we design our campaigns. It changes our strategies. It changes our theories of change. I was listening to the video, which was brilliant, before we went live. And I loved hearing the reference to, we need to meet people where they are and we need to really connect with people and so forth, which is all totally right on point. I think it needs to go further. And I think that for those of us working on the front lines of climate advocacy, and regardless of your position and your background and your, disciplinary orientation, I believe that we each need to become more skilled in understanding the emotional, psychological terrain that we are in, whether we like it or not, right? And it really means going beyond thinking about values. It means going beyond thinking about what do people believe. It's actually going to, the level of how does, anxiety, how does that change the way that we process information? How does fear, how does, how do all these things that this issue is inevitably going to evoke for people? And to do that in a way that avoids the tendency to want to then sort of get away from all those complicated, difficult responses and feelings. And we want to then become basically cheerleaders and solutioneers. And we want to stay positive and we want to stay really upbeat because we want to get away from all the negative, all the unpleasant, uncomfortable feelings and psychological responses that this issue does and will evoke. I don't care who you are, it will do that. And so that's what I want to spend some time talking with you about and offering some ways of framing this and thinking about this that I hope can support you and, equip you to be more effective in the work that we're doing. So I do have some slides, and I understand not everyone is watching, so I'm going to do my best to not rely too much on the visual, but I'm going to run through these for those who can watch, and I'm going to share now. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So, as I mentioned, I've been kind of working at this interface of climate change, environment, and psychology for, a long time. And back in the day, not many people were talking about this. connection, now it's really hit, which is really good news for us. This is incredibly positive that we're now seeing. This is just almost a random collection of pieces that have been coming out in the past, recent several weeks in mainstream media outlets, basically giving voice and articulating and naming the relationship of climate change, environmental degradation and anxiety. And, we're seeing terms like eco-anxiety, we're seeing terms of climate grief, that kind of thing. It's really hit. So that's all really good. And that's the moment that we're in right now. And it's only increasing, of course, with COVID-19, with the racial inequity kind of the explosion into our consciousness of all this stuff that's been going on for so long. It's now kind of burst through our consciousness, can't be ignored anymore. And that's the moment that we're living in right now. And I would say, and I wrote about, there's an article that came out recently in Dame magazine, an interview where I talk about how seeing what's going on right now through the lens of trauma is actually really constructive. It's really helps us. So I want to also just signal that it's not only me that's speaking and articulating these things, but I exist within a community of incredibly insightful, wise, and experienced clinicians who have been working on the front lines of trauma in a clinical world for quite some time, who are now bridging those worlds with climate change. So we've got Caroline Hickman in the UK, Leslie Davenport based in the US, whose book, she's working on a new book actually right now about children and climate change and how to communicate with children. Let's see if I can move. I can't see my full screen. I think the next person is Wendy Greenspun. And she's in, let me just see if I can move my Zoom thing. Yeah, I can't. It's okay. So Wendy is at Columbia, based in New York. Lise Van Susteren, who has a new book that's just come out, which I think has done some work with CCL, Emotional Inflammation, I think is the book, and Britt Ray. And Britt Ray is a young broadcaster, writer, has a new book coming out next year called Generation Dread, very insightful, speaking to younger generations impacted by eco-anxiety. So the tendency, I want to kind of present my infographic here, which is that the tendency that we've had for quite some time working in this space is that there's the bad news, the devastating impacts, the risk if we don't act faster, what's actually already going on now, and a tendency to want to then kind of ricochet from the bad news into here are the solutions, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, it kind of has a rational logic to it. When you think about, well, if there's a problem, then you've got to have a solution, right? Which we do. So I'm not discounting that. Hold on just a second. Let me just move my Zoom so it's not blocking my view. There we go. Okay. So then we've got, the kind of common ricochet of despair, and then we want to go into hope. So I think some of you can relate to this, where you might be experiencing in your own lives and your own experience this kind of like, well, at times I really feel deep despair, because if you are aware and awake to what's going on, it's I would say it's impossible, frankly, not to have some level of despair. And at the same time, there's a lot of reason for what we would call hope or optimism and so forth. So this is this kind of common ricochet. And what I want to suggest to you all is that we blow those ricochets, those binaries up, and that we really force ourselves to be more nuanced and more complex and complicated in how we relate to the hard, painful feelings and stuff that comes up, with the need to be motivated and to feel inspired and to feel kind of energized in doing this work. And so one of the ways that I think is really important to do that is by recognizing that when we are in confrontation, when we have to engage with what I would call, hard truths, which climate change is, difficult truths, that we as humans, we tend to want to avoid it, and we go into all kinds of denial, soft denial, hard denial, and so forth. And a more kind of common type of denial, which is disavowal, where people actually are aware. So there's polls that go out with the 6 Americas, and you could have as many surveys as you want go out, and you will find that a lot of people will say in the surveys and the polls, I care, or I'm aware that this is an issue, and there's nothing happening, very little happening. And that's a really good example of how we have this ability to know and not really feel it. It sort of remains an intellectual level, and we go into the disavowal, which is I'm choosing to, kind of not deal with that right now and carry on with my life. And there's the rationalizing, right? These are all defense mechanisms. These are all strategies that we use. And so the tendency is that we feel from those on the front lines that we have to become cheerleaders, that we have to try to persuade and motivate people to kind of see our side. And what I want to posit to you is that's a false assumption. That's actually not correct. So I'm just a few more minutes, so I'm going to run through this pretty quickly here, which is that, people can tell when they are being pitched, when they're being, kind of cheerleaded at. And I have a quote on the slide by Peter Senge, which is really wise. People don't resist change, they resist being changed. And so the thing is that we have this incredible radar that goes off when we can tell if someone is coming to us with an agenda who's trying to change us, which then poses a really, a challenging question back on us, because we actually are trying to make change happen. So what are we supposed to do in that case, right? So, what's really common is that we have this tendency to fall into these modes of relating and communicating. And one is being an educator, which I know we all know. I heard on the video, it's like giving people the fact and information is not sufficient, but there's still a lot of educating that goes on. There's a tendency to want to, be the cheerleader, the writer. Writing is something from motivational interviewing, where this is the moral reason why this is the right thing to do. And you're kind of have that pointing finger vibe going on. There's the cheerleader, right? Which is, I want to keep it inspired. I want to keep you feeling positive and so forth, which can be really exhausting. And what I want to suggest to you is that there's another way forward, which is what it means to be a guide. And what it means to be a guide, the concept of guiding comes out of motivational interviewing, which is the most evidence-based field in the public health sector that relates to how people change, and especially around behavior change. And I think it has so much insight and potential to inform the work that we're doing on the front lines of climate change. So guides, what they do when you're guiding is that you are providing information. You are making sure that people are informed. You are being a bit of a cheerleader. You are kind of giving people a sense that there's a lot of possibility. There's a lot of opportunity and all of that. But the thing about being a guide that's different from being a cheerleader, an educator, a writer, is that a guide provides what is called, or what I'm calling, a relational home. And why do we use that term, a relational home? Go back to what I said 10 minutes ago about how climate change evokes really difficult, complicated responses in people, often unconsciously. It's a traumatic zone. It's very activating for us in many, many, many different ways, and many different, depending on who you are and where you are. One of the things that we know from just best practice psychological work is that we are far more likely to engage with what's hard and to engage with change if we experience ourselves in a relational home, which is obviously a lot of what CCL is about. CCL is itself a relational home. Everyone on this call is experiencing this relational home right now. Another term for relational home is a container. So some of you may know the concept of a container from psychological practice, especially in the clinical world, which is that when we are in a container, we can actually handle and take hard stuff much more easily. There's a capacity, there's more resilience, there's more agility when we are in a container. Now, what is a container? A container doesn't necessarily mean two people sitting in a room, literally in a container. A container can also mean a narrative. A container can be a really amazing campaign. A container can be, bringing people together in small groups, like your regional meetings, like the events that I've actually been at with CCL. Those are containers. Now, the thing about containers that you want to really consider is how emotionally and psychologically safe are those containers. And that's where I think I'll wrap with my kind of final point here is how do we relate with the hard stuff, and how do we make a home for the hard stuff? How do we welcome the difficult feelings and not be phobic about them or allergic to them and think that they're going to take us down? Because I can tell you that if we have that attitude in our own work, in our own selves, and with others, we are actually not as resilient. There's a sort of a rigidness, there's a brittleness, there's a lack of suppleness, because these are really hard things. And so that's one of the things that I found to be so powerful in my training and my exposure to work like motivational interviewing, is that it's what's called, Carl Rogers has this term, the paradox of change, which is that when we feel that we can really be ourselves, that we're really understood and listened to, deeply listened to, then we are far more open to receiving and being open to information that will change us. So I'm going to just, I talk about these A's: anxiety, ambivalence, and aspiration. I'm going to actually, I'm going to stop my sharing. Hold on a minute. This is always where my slides get unhappy. Hold on. It'll take a minute. I'll just keep talking while this is frozen on ambivalence of all things. So that's a good point to end on. So I talk in my work about these 3 or 4 A's, and the 3 or 4 A's are anxiety, ambivalence, aspiration, and then I've added an anger is the 4th A, which is that I'm not able to get out of this. Hold on. Which is, recognizing that usually these things are going on with people, in a variety of kind of levels, that there's anxieties that get evoked. Oops.
You're good, Renee. I think
Okay.
Rick just pulled them down for you.
Oh, thank you. So there's anxieties, there's ambivalence. If we had more time, I could talk more about that, and maybe that can come up in discussion. But ambivalence is where people are really in conflict within themselves. Like, part of me wants to engage, but I'm afraid, or I'm worried what people are going to think, or what about my constituents, and what about my stakeholders, and what about this, and what about that. That's ambivalence, which is not the same as people not caring. It's not quite the same as, a lack of concern. It's where people feel really torn. And so it's really, really important in our work that we're hyper tuned into ambivalence. It's almost like we have this incredible radar to listen for where's the anxiety, where's the ambivalence, and to be able to then really name that and speak to that. So there's more to say, and I know we're at time, so sorry for going on longer. The last thing I'll just mention is that I do have an initiative called Project Inside Out, which has been developing some resources and tools to share out with climate groups and organizations, and you can check that out. It's online, projectinsideout.net. And I'm creating these sort of guiding principles that can really help, I think, people working on the front lines. And one of them is really what I'm speaking to today, which is the concept of attunement and our capacity and really, skill building around how can we be attuned, not only to ourselves, but to those that we're working with. So I'll end here and we can keep talking in the discussion.
That's great. Thank you for sharing all of that. We have lots of questions here in the Q&A, so I'll start with one from Peter. He has shared a quote from Greta Thunberg. He said in one of her early interviews, she said, "I don't care if what we're doing is hopeful, we need to do it anyway. Even if there's no hope left and everything is hopeless, we must do what we can." And he's asking your opinion on that attitude. Do you think that that's damaging or is that helpful?
I think it's incredibly helpful. It's like what she's articulating is it's a psychologically astute perspective and insight, which is that if we rely on hope to keep us kind of motivated, it's very tenuous. It's okay to have a relationship with hope and hopefulness, but it doesn't really work as a theory of change. Because it's precarious. It's leaving things too much on the kind of externally influenced in terms of how it informs us. Really, if you talk to people who are in this for the long haul, what really people are rooted into is not relying on, this hope. What people are rooted into is, this is what it means for me to be a human being right now. And I can't imagine being any other way. This is just kind of what it means to be alive. So it's kind of outside of the whole kind of hope, despair framework.
Got it. We have another question from Stephen. He's asking, are people looking at how people have reacted to COVID, the coronavirus, as a guide for how we might react to climate change, especially as it's becoming more globally urgent?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's so much to be learned right now around COVID and our relationship. The way I see it is, what is our relationship with reality? It really comes down to that. And how do we obfuscate? How do we create kind of barriers between ourselves and reality? And so without question, we're seeing in broad display exactly the full spectrum of that. The one thing I would just say about COVID, again, it's a traumatic event. It's a collective and personal traumatic event for all of us in varying levels and degrees. The one thing I would just say about people working in climate for a long time is the tendency to want to kind of rush in and say, see, this is what we've been talking about. We let's not go back. We have this opportunity to go forward. Let's not go back. I think there's a lot of anxiety in the climate space of, oh my God, like what an incredible opportunity we have. We shouldn't want to go back. And we need to do everything we can to kind of propel this rupture, this trauma into a constructive, productive direction. And that makes sense, but I think it's incredibly important if we go back to attunement and we go back to recognizing that we're all in a state of trauma in some way or another, that we're not really at our best selves, our best thinking selves when we're traumatized. And so I think we need to tread with utmost compassion right now, which is to say, be a guide, think about motivational interviewing, use a lot of questions, allow people a lot of space for being listened to, being understood before we come in and offer solutions, ideas, information, suggestions, and so forth.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had flagged a quote from one of your, the recent CNN piece that you published that I would like to just read, if that's okay with you, so that folks are all on the same page. In this op-ed, you said that saying, of course, gives us permission to show up as our full, effective selves by first acknowledging our feelings. And you wrote, of course you feel sad. Of course you're worried about your kids and your family. Of course you feel angry but aren't sure why. Of course you're wondering where leadership is. Of course you're grieving for the losses that are happening and will continue. Of course you feel energized to show up as fully as you can. Of course you care. And you said we can all help each other and our beautiful and suffering planet right now by starting with saying to one person or a whole cast of thousands, of course you feel that way. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. Is there anything you want to, anything else you want to say on that idea?
I would just thank you. I would just say that there's something that happens when we hear the words, of course, or that we feel that our experience is validated, that happens at a neurochemical level, which is that we can shift. We can go from trying to protect ourselves and kind of defend my reality and my experience to, okay, you get me. I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. And that is the basis for moving forward into action. That's the basis to allow ourselves to access our prefrontal cortex and where our creativity and strategy and foresight lies. I guess I would turn it back on you as well, since you called that out, just to hear how that lands for you and what does that mean for you in the context of your work.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that it spoke to me because it's so, it is so powerful, and it does resonate so much with how CCL approaches this work, which is that we don't often come in facts first, but like you saw in the video, we're trying to meet people where they are. And in some ways, we're trying to bring that, of course, message to where they are on climate change and say, of course you're overwhelmed. Of course you want to act and you have all these ideas and you're not sure where to start. And, we try to do that in our, I think in our work day to day.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I just want to add that it's very, very hard to do this. It's not, when the stakes are so high and when we know what we know, I think it's the hardest thing for any human to do. So I don't want to downplay the toughness of it. That, and again, some of this comes out of the public health sector where people know a lot about, addiction, about food, about diet and nutrition and all of that. And we have to sometimes sit on our hands. Like we have to actually hold back from jumping forward with, but don't you get it? Don't you see, if we don't do this, we're going to just be screwed. Like we have that incredible desire and impulse, which makes sense, but we're far more effective when we become skillful at knowing when to hold back, when to kind of pause and sit on what we know long enough to let others really come forward and feel heard and understood.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lertzman, for being with us today. That was all really valuable. We appreciate your help navigating these tough times.
Thank you. It's great to spend time with you. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions.
Oh, no problem. We'll send people to you on Twitter.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so now we will go over some CCL news and successes since the last time that we met. So I'm about to throw a lot at you pretty quickly. So just a reminder for everyone, the recording of this call will be available afterward on CCL's YouTube channel. So if you want to go back over anything, you can watch it again later. So since we last met, we held our annual conference and lobbying for 2020. So this was our first all virtual June event. The conference had 4,685 participants across Zoom and our social media live streams. And from our Zoom data, we can see that 37 total countries were represented. So we had a few standouts among those. We had 29 folks tuning in from Canada, 24 from Colombia, and 15 from Mexico. So shout out to our international folks. And all these thousands of attendees got to hear from two sitting senators, Mike Braun and Chris Coons. We heard from one former congressional representative, Carlos Curbelo, and a former World Bank official, Rachel Kite. So if you missed any of that, you can see the conference programming on our YouTube channel. And then after our conference programming, our volunteers held 442 meetings with the House and the Senate. And then you guys also sent 1,917 messages to Congress through our Write Congress tool during the month of June, which is incredible. And our lobbying efforts got some great media coverage. In particular, I want to give a shout out to our volunteers in Jacksonville, Florida. And Ricky, you can hop to the next slide. Our volunteers in Jacksonville, Florida, sent out a press release to local reporters, and they got a great public radio story aired about their lobby meeting. So we'll put the link to that story in the chat so you can check it out. And then since the conference, Congress has really gotten back into the swing of working on climate change. So in the last few weeks, we've seen a new co-sponsor sign on to the Energy Innovation Act, Representative Tony Cardenas from California. So now there's a total of 81 members on this bill. And in addition to that, since our lobby meetings, we've seen 20 new co-sponsors sign on to the bills that were our secondary asks. And 13 of those were offices that we lobbied ourselves and asked them to sign on, so we can really see our impact on all of those bills. We've also seen the introduction of the Growing Climate Solutions Act in the Senate, which is evenly bipartisan with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The Senate Agriculture Committee held a hearing on that bill, which indicates that they intend to mark it up and to move it out of committee. And then a House version of that bill was introduced by 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. So this is really exciting progress to see Republicans and Democrats teaming up on this climate-focused bill, and we'll continue to build support for this bill into the summer and the fall. And another exciting piece of news is that the Reclaim Act has passed the House. This is our tweet where we posted about the news last week. This bill, the Reclaim Act, was one of our major asks during June lobbying this year, and it's something that CCL volunteers have been lobbying on since June 2019. It would allocate existing funds to clean up abandoned mines, which would create jobs in coal communities. And it was added to an infrastructure package, which has now passed the House. So our lobbying helped push this across the finish line. Congratulations to everybody who worked on this or who brought it up in your lobby meetings last month. And finally, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis released a report with their recommendations for what Congress should do about climate change. And that report included carbon pricing. So one of the quotes from the report said, "Congress should put a price on carbon to correct the failure of the market to account for the costs of unmitigated pollution." So we'll have some more information and analysis about this up on CCL Community soon. But in general, it's exciting to see this big report come out of Congress showing that they're taking the issue seriously and that they see carbon pricing should be a part of the solution. So with all of that exciting news in mind, let's get to work this month. We are going full steam ahead. We're resuming our monthly calling campaigns. We're writing LTEs as much as we can do while staying socially distant. So specifically for July, our action sheet includes these suggestions. So first, you could invite your member of Congress to a virtual CCL meeting. Members of Congress are always looking for ways to connect with constituents during this time of social distancing, and you can help them do that. And just a reminder that we are nonpartisan, so this event or this meeting is not about supporting a candidate, but about hearing from your current representative. And also this month, you could ask prominent community leaders to show support for the Energy Innovation Act. You might start by reviewing the results of your June lobby meetings and ask yourselves what endorsements would be most useful to build support with your member of Congress. And then a quick action you can do is to tweet your thanks and appreciation to the co-sponsors of the Growing Climate Solutions Act. So these ideas and more details are all on the July action sheet. And in Canada, our volunteers will be pushing for meetings with their MPs and making more connections in their communities. So before we sign off today, I'd like you to save the date for our next conference. We'll hold it on December 5th and 6th, and it's going to be totally virtual, followed by lobbying. And this will be after the election. So we'll be headed into a new session of Congress, and we'll take this time to reset, refocus, re-energize for 2021 and beyond. So thanks everyone for being with us today. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Stay safe, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Flannery. Thank you, Dr. Lertzman.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lertzman.
All right.
Thank you. I'm sorry I went over and didn't have time for all the questions.
No, totally fine. Folks always ask lots and lots of questions, but we'll send them to your Twitter. We will send them to your